I'm Metta Spencer, and I'm in Toronto, just quivering with excitement and thrill because I get to have a conversation with somebody that I've wanted to get to know for a long time. Her name is Jamila Raqib, and she was, for 17 years, the closest assistant and associate of Gene Sharp, a man who is at the very top of my pantheon of peace saints. I think in one of my other videos the other day, I said that the two greatest political thinkers and leaders of the 20th century, in my opinion, were Mikhail Gorbachev and Gene Sharp. So I had the privilege of knowing Gene Sharp a little bit, or at least for a long time. I would call him a dear friend. He maintained an organization called the Albert Einstein Institution in Massachusetts and also in Boston. And he wrote a book which came to my attention first. I think I met him in 1982 or 83 in Dubrovnik, where there was a great meeting that UNESCO funded, and he was one of the resource people. And it was a very impressive moment where I learned a little bit about nonviolent resistance, which was his lifelong interest and commitment. And he died about, a year ago, I think? Was it a year ago, Jamila? Yes.
Yes.
So the organization is continuing under the leadership of Jamila Raqib. Say hi, Jamila.
Hi, Metta, and hello, everyone. It's great to be with you this evening.
It's wonderful to meet you because I knew about you for, I think you worked for him 17 years as his closest associate before he died, and you were really his family in a way. I think he never married, did he?
No, he did not.
So just looked after his orchids.
Yes.
It was a wonderful film I saw 5-10 years ago. Photo of Jamila and Gene climbing to the top of his house in East Boston so he could water his collection of orchids, which is very sweet. Anyway, so now Jamila is continuing the work, and it's a pleasure to get to know you. Tell me about yourself. I hear that you began to work for him as a newcomer to the US when you were about 20 years old, and you came from Afghanistan. Is that right?
Yes, I had actually been in the US since I was 4, so I wasn't a newcomer at that point. But I did come to the US as a refugee from Afghanistan during the Soviet war. So I traveled here with my family and have been here ever since.
Now, I think you originally said, we had a little chat a couple of days ago, and I think you said that initially you weren't quite prepared to believe that nonviolent civil resistance was a very workable way of alternative to war. Tell me about the change in your own thinking as you got acquainted with this wonderful thinker.
Sure. So yeah, I didn't come to the work as a sort of believer in nonviolent means. I was intrigued. I thought it sounded nice, right? This is something we hear about a lot, that the idea is nice, but it's not workable. That in fact, it's rooted in the way we want the world to be, not in actually how it is, right? This is the perception that I think many people have, even today. And I was, under the same sort of misconceptions, partly because in my upbringing, as in many other people's around the world, there's this idea that violence is the most powerful thing that you can do, and that none of us like it, but we all have to accept it. And we accept it for so-called good purposes, defending our families, defending our communities, to deal with the most serious political issues of our time: oppression, dictatorship, invasions and occupations, and violations of our human rights and our political rights. That violence is what people must do. That it's not just a right but a responsibility to resist using whatever means you have access to, and that includes violence. I also was, again, someone who had personally seen violence and war. And what's really interesting is that having experienced violence and war didn't teach me that violence was morally wrong. It taught me that it was incredibly destructive, but again, justified. So this is the kind of thinking, that was going through my head, and I was thinking about these things constantly, thinking about violence and war and oppression. And so, I found myself at Gene's, doorstep, shall we say. I applied for a position. He was looking for someone to handle translations of his work, and not to do the translations, but to manage them. So
was he looking for anybody to translate anything into any of the Afghan languages?
No, not necessarily. In fact, unfortunately, I wouldn't, I probably wouldn't qualify to do the translations, because he was really, really particular. And he said that, clarity was so important, precision was so important, because how could we have effective action if we didn't have clear thinking? And how could we have clear thinking about nonviolent resistance if we didn't have language to describe these concepts, which were so misunderstood? So he was really particular about translation. So together he and I came up with these translation guidelines, which are basically, how do you produce translations using a translator and then an evaluator to develop a key terminology, the important words in the field. And then, through that process, the idea is that you would have really precise translations that really reflect the clarity with which he wrote. I mean, his writings are incredibly, incredibly precise. And he didn't want, biases that would be inserted into translations because people, weren't doing them right. So I was hired to oversee that process, to really learn about, that translation guidelines, and to make sure that both translators and then the people evaluating them would be working together in a way that would produce the highest quality translations. So that's what I was hired to do.
Well, now, was there a demand for these publications in other countries, or was somebody funding him to just get them out there and hope that they would find an audience for them? I'm not sure whether the demand was greater than the supply, or the supply led.
Yeah, the demand was definitely greater than the supply, and remains the case. Right? There's just massive interest and demand. And in those years, it was very interesting, because when I came on in 2002, it was a very different world in terms of how people access this material. I mean, the internet was still pretty new, and, it definitely existed, but the way that the writings were distributed were really sort of incremental. It was like the way you would imagine back in the day, with like activist to activist. So, Matt, I'm sure you've heard the story about how someone in Thailand saw From Dictatorship to Democracy in a bookstore window, and then somebody from Indonesia. And they took that book and then physically carried it to Indonesia, where it was translated by activists there. And that the Serbian translation of From Dictatorship to Democracy was because a peace activist from California physically took it to Serbia. I mean, this is how people accessed the material back then. And so we saw this sort of incremental spread. So, for example, From Dictatorship to Democracy, which is now in nearly 40 languages, that was, at the time that I started working with the institution, there were 4 languages of Burma, which were paid for. Those were ones that were, they were paid for by an organization, and then the institution actually supported those translations. Beyond that, to my knowledge, there's been maybe 1 or 2 others that we actually encourage the preparation of. The rest of them are done because people in their societies, see that there's a potential benefit to this knowledge being available in their language.
Mm-hmm. To what extent were any publications, both by Jane or even by other writers about nonviolence, including Gandhi, to what extent were they available in socialist countries before the wall came down, before the Soviet Union broke apart? Let me say what I'm referring to. I was in Poland before, I think it was 89, I don't remember what year. Anyway, spent a lot of time talking to activists. And they told me that they'd not been able to read Gandhi. I don't think they even knew anything about Gene Sharp at that point. but they had seen the film Gandhi. Apparently that was okay, and they had not been able to get the text, anything that Gandhi had written, but they watched the film over and over and over again. And my sense was that that movie really changed the world, because it was really something they were studying carefully and it played into some of the movements that took place in 1989 as the anti-communist movement took place in Europe, but in other places as well. There was, I think in Chile, there was a movement. There were a number of nonviolent struggles going on that year. And I don't know how much of it Gene Sharp influenced and how much it was influenced by the film rather than any written text. Do you have any idea?
No, that's a really difficult question to answer, Metta, and I think it would require like an entire team of researchers to look into that. I was recently reviewing some notes from Tiananmen Square, where Jean was in the days before the crackdown. So this is like May 30th of '89, where we have these handwritten notes that of interviews that Jean did with people, and he had asked them, what are the resources that you're using to figure out how, what to do? And the film Gandhi was cited in that material.
I actually interviewed Jean along with Mubarak Awad. For some reason, they happened to be at the same place at the same time. And I interviewed them for Peace Magazine just a little while after Tiananmen Square. And Jean said he'd been there, but he wasn't there at the moment of the crackdown, but he'd been there just a few hours before. And one of the things I remember he said was that, there had been an effort to go on a hunger strike, but these young people didn't realize that you have to drink water. So they were not only refusing food, but any kind of liquid, which of course you can't do that. And it meant that the whole thing didn't last very long. But I think he came back with my impression, if I recall correctly, is that he came back with the resolution that it was important to get things translated into Chinese and distributed there.
Yes.
And is that what happened afterward? Do you recall?
I don't know. I don't know whether there was an effort. I wasn't with him in those years. I do know that from my conversations with him about what he learned from being in China in those days was that people had been acting with great bravery, but they didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't have access to good information, and that led to the kind of tragic consequences that we saw. And so it really strengthened his understanding that resources would, help people be more effective and avert some of those tragedies. So in terms of whether more material was developed for China, I don't know. Much of our material was developed in recent years. Self-liberation and the accompanying readings of 900 pages were translated by a Taiwanese group.
Into China. Were they distributed there widely, or is it impossible?
Well, yes, I think they were certainly distributed there. And to what extent, I'm not sure. They exist in PDF format. And so to my understanding, people accessed them and brought them back to China. In fact, there's a person serving a very hefty jail sentence for distributing copies of 5 books, 3 of them by Jean.
I know that in a very indirect and limited way that during the coup in Moscow, there was an influence. Gene Sharp had an influence, because I remember talking to someone who told me, a woman, who told me that they didn't have photocopiers. Photocopying had been kind of forbidden during the socialist period, or ordinary people couldn't get access. And later, they just didn't have enough of them, but they had fax machines. And so they took the 198 things that you could, what is the word for it? Methods of nonviolent resistance, these tactics, I guess you'd say. And it's all, I guess, on just a few sheets of paper, right? And they put them through fax machines to copy them. And then they went around putting them up on telephone poles, but they got torn down too quickly. So the person I talked to said that they started putting them up in women's washrooms because they would stay there longer. Now, how much influence that had, I don't know, but I have a friend who was at that point, had been a member of the Moscow City Council, and I'd seen him at one of Jean's powwows or, gatherings or conferences, I think in Boston or New York, I can't remember where. And so he had gone back and he wandered around the streets talking to the people driving the tanks, asking them not to attack. And that's, of course, probably not why they didn't attack. It was probably orders from on high or from Yeltsin or somebody. But at any rate, there were a few, at least, people knowledgeable about nonviolent resistance who were in the streets and doing things during the opposition to the coup against Gorbachev.
Yeah, I think that certainly we've seen the methods. We've seen that list of methods, the 198 methods of nonviolent action that Jane put together and started putting together back in the 50s. And then eventually that was in the Methods of Nonviolent Action in his 73 book. That is something that has just captured the imagination of so many people and has been, just distributed so widely. And yeah, it's still the piece that gets the most attention, Sometimes we think it's because his other books are like 900 pages, but people do like a good list. But I think more than that, it conveys a lot. It conveys that there's just this diversity of methods available to us that have been used historically, and that, that list isn't complete, and that the limits to the list are the limits to human imagination. And so there's potentially thousands of methods, if not more. And so, yeah, I think that even now I get so many requests for reprints and translations of the methods.
We keep it on our website, the Peace Magazine website, along with, some of the other writings or key articles that we did. I did a number of interviews or articles about Gene and by other people about his ideas, like Bob Helvey wrote a book and we have a review of that and so on. I did an interview with Bob Helvey about the struggle in Burma. Tell me about your own transition. You arrived as a willing worker, but skeptical. And how long did it take you to see that there might be something practical about this?
Not long. In fact, I've talked to a lot of people who've come to the work as skeptics, and they say that, in fact, it's sort of a light bulb moment. And it happens very quickly. This realization that this is not the approach that is, that we often hear about associated with so-called nonviolence, that this is really pragmatic, that it's rooted in history, it's rooted in evidence of what people have done. And that in spite of the fact that mostly people were acting with great bravery, but they didn't know what they were doing, and nonviolent resistance has achieved what it has, even though we don't really know that history very well, that was really kind of earth-shattering for me, because I think it reveals possibilities. And for those of us who understands that strong action is necessary, but that it need not be violence, that's really kind of eye-opening and a very, very powerful moment, that you can be tough, you can be effective, you can act in accordance with strategy, and that this requires skills. That's really empowering. And so it happened very quickly. It happened as I realized that if I was going to be working there with Gene, that I needed to know what his work was about, even if it was a one-year position, which is what I was told that it was. I shouldn't expect job security. And I thought, great, because I probably don't want to stay. I am likely to, go on to do the next thing, which was, go back to grad school. And so I thought, still good to learn what I can. And I think that this approach comes out very clearly from his writings. And that's what's been reported to me by the hundreds of people that I've spoken to since, about really what is it about this work that is attractive. It's the idea that it's not easy, but that it's possible. I think that's, and that you can do it self-reliantly, right? That you don't have to wait for an outsider to save you, but that in spite of the violations against your communities, that, you can do something, and that by what you do and what you refuse to do, you have power. I mean, I think this is really the crux of it, and what's, incredible about the work.
The time I met him, I think it was 82 or 80, maybe 83, but in Dubrovnik, UNESCO had brought together a number of resource people. There were more resource people than there were students, and I was a student there. And but the interesting thing was one of the many interesting points there was a bit of disagreement among the resource people who were there. Some of them, for example, one was Narayan Desai, who was the son of Gandhi's close secretary, and he'd been brought up as Gandhi's grandchild, in effect, called him Bapu. And the people around him didn't quite agree with Gene's position on one issue, and that is that they regarded it as a spiritual matter. It was nonviolence was to be done from a purified soul, so to speak. I think Gandhi actually went through a period of self-examination before he'd lead a campaign and so on, because he felt that you had to be worthy, you had to be spiritually adept in order to do it right. And here was Gene saying, no, you don't have to be a saint at all. You can be, in fact, quite a bad person and still use these methods. And that debate never quite subsided. I kept hearing echoes of it. I guess still, although I don't hear it much anymore. Again, can you comment on that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that the debate has never really gone away. The idea, though, that this sort of spiritual piece is a requirement as a prerequisite to using the technique, in my mind, is an obstacle. And I think precisely Gene's sort of discovery, if you will, at least for him, that this could be used by people who didn't share the same belief system, I think made possible a number of opportunities. And that, he initially thought it was a liability. He said, this is heresy, that people could act effectively without believing the same thing. This really goes against centuries of how we understand nonviolent resistance. And then he came to see it as a opportunity. I had a lot of discussions with him. My own path to this supported Gene's view. This idea that my own personal struggle in terms of my transformation to be a better person, more spiritual person, was something that was always in flux. And that's very personal for each of us. But the idea that I can act with others for particular objectives, because I find that there's an advantage to doing so, is something that for me didn't require the principled belief. So
I remember there was one kind of insight that I gathered from an example that he gave, which was that sometimes people resort to nonviolent struggle because they don't have weapons. If they had them, they would use them, but they can't get them. So what else do? Well, you might be able to, do something nonviolent.
Sure.
And then they're sometimes surprised to find that actually was a better technique than using, as he put it, if you use violence against the power structure of your society, you're using the method that is closest to their hearts, closest that they are most skilled with and that they have in great abundance. They use violence. The state has access and almost monopoly over the use of violence. Mm-hmm. So you're putting yourself at the mercy of methods that you will be beaten with very often.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that, this really speaks to the fact that nonviolent resistance is an alternative to violence. It's also an alternative to doing nothing, right? So so I think
that's true.
And I think that the reasons that people explore these means and have used them historically are diverse. And the fact that some people use them for spiritual reasons, that they are more consistent with their own principled beliefs, that they actually reject the use of violence because they believe it to be morally wrong in principle, is undeniable, that there are people who are using this for those reasons. But to put that as a requirement, right, is, I think, the problem, because that's very off-putting to people. It's very off-putting to, it's basically, for many of the people that I've talked to, it's like a conversation non-starter. The idea that an outsider would come in and tell you violence is morally wrong and you have to use these other means because it's a superior way to conduct a struggle, morally superior, I think is not compelling. The idea that it's a smarter way to conduct a struggle is more compelling. And either way, I think for Gene, and I think I agree with him on this, that to understand it, that it's helpful to divorce it from the spiritual piece, because then you see it as a political technique in terms of how it operates, rooted in power and a matching of various capacities, and figuring out how to do it effectively, therefore becomes, again, a bit more clear.
Mm-hmm. Another contrast that surprised me, I don't know whether he was serious, but at one point it sounded as if Gene was distancing himself from the peace movement, from peace activists. And maybe he was sort of joking for the moment, but he definitely had a point. His point when he explained it to me was that many peace activists just hate conflict, and they try to suppress conflict and not engage in conflict. Whereas what he is doing is trying to show people how to fight effectively, but without injuring other people. He gave an example of a meeting he'd gone to with some Quakers, I think, and some woman said something like, with indignation, with irritation, she said, well, all you're doing is just trying to fight a war without weapons and without injuring people and without killing people. As if, well, that's a pretty stupid thing to do. Well, no, in fact, that's the whole point. Can you fight a war without killing people and without injuring people physically? Can you fight a war non-violently? And the notion that it was okay to fight a war at all was anathema to her. And it certainly is the case with many of my friends who I find peace activists often are so reluctant to engage in conflict that there's sometimes a denial of situations that are really serious, because they don't want to open it up and look at the mess that's under there, roll the stone over and find all the snakes.
Yeah, I do think that's been a failure of the peace movement. And I think increasingly people do understand that conflict itself is not necessarily undesirable. Either way, it is inevitable. So now we have to figure out what then.
Right.
Giving people tools and weapons, right? Nonviolent weapons, nonviolent tools to conduct struggles effectively and powerfully, then is a very compelling way to go. But yeah, I've heard that story about, well, all you're doing is taking the violence out of war, and the idea that that would be a bad thing.
Kind of funny.
It is. It's incredible, but I think it communicates a level to which that person did understand nonviolent resistance, and the fact that it's not about doing away with conflict, it's about doing away with the destructiveness of war and violence.
Mm-hmm. Well, so over time, it seems to me he started off basically giving it mainly a history of nonviolent struggle. He had a lot of good stories about historical events. And then he acquired a following in that people in various countries would come to him asking how they could overthrow their dictatorships. And I believe he, for a long time, I think I was proselytizing in favor of getting more people to take up nonviolent struggle than I had any business doing, because Gene was quite clear that he didn't tell people that they ought to do something. It was only if they asked him would he tell them how to do it, but he didn't advise them that they should. And I think there have been times that I've thought I've been impatient with societies or people that I knew, and especially that was in the Soviet Union, for putting up with dictatorship and not doing much to resist it. And I now think that he was right and I was wrong, that you don't have any business telling people when they have to do it. But anyway, that is one of the things that it seems to me he was pretty clear about. He did get this groups of people coming asking for advice over a period of time. I don't know when that began to happen, but the Albert Einstein Institution became in a way a source of information to anybody in the world who wanted to know how to launch a civil resistance movement. And you were there throughout a good part of that time, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, so it had, in my estimation, he became very famous, and it became very popular during the 2000s, I would say, 1990, late 1990s, and so on. And yet, there have been some real changes in the course of public opinion about nonviolent struggle. And I know that, to me, that one of the big turning points was the Arab Spring, because I was so hopeful. Also, one of the movements in Burma, the struggle for which I thought was going to succeed, but it didn't. But a number of places that I thought they were going to succeed, and they didn't. And I think that what happened in the Arab Spring was a pretty sobering lesson, because the outcome in the long run, although people, for example, in Tahrir Square, the young Egyptians and so on, did this superb movement that was so very effective. It looked so effective in bringing down Mubarak, and yet, what came afterwards was very disappointing, because they didn't have any plans for the implementation of a new democratic constitution or new institutions. And I guess I think I was assuming that the popularity or the effectiveness or the appeal of nonviolence diminished after the Arab Spring. But you told me before we started that there's a continuation of that. Mm-hmm. You say it's Erica Chenoweth's current research showing that the demand for nonviolent resistance, the desire for it, is continuing unabated since the Arab Spring? Can you explain?
Yeah, I don't want to, speak for Erica's research. She, I invite people to check out her website and to be in touch with her. But the research definitely shows that the frequency of nonviolent action is increasing, that challenges to various opponents and the use of nonviolent action is definitely steady, if not again, increasing. And we're seeing lots of evidence of that. And I'm seeing evidence of that in terms of hits to our website, requests for material, requests for translations, requests for workshops and consultations. And I think that what has happened is that there are a lot of new questions about how nonviolent resistance works in, to deal with current challenges, how the dynamics of this type of struggle operate in face of, again, different types of opponents that don't look like they did even 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and certainly not, 40 and 50 years ago and beyond. So I think, how does this operate in a democratic system or in a more democratic system? How does it relate to, or how can it be used against energy companies and to defend, to protect against climate degradation? And on and on, I think there's just a variety of new questions, but I think that just really highlights the need to advance the technique, to advance the study of nonviolent resistance, to understand that applying it has new challenges. Also that we're increasingly facing more sophisticated opponents, opponents that understand that, for example, violent repression can be counterproductive, which means that they're using less traditional means of violence. They're still doing the beatings and the arrests and things like that. But now there's other ways to, get people to abandon their activities. There's other means to collapse movements. And so I think that movements and people and activists and organizers around the world just have to understand that the battlefield has changed, but that the technique remains incredibly effective way to wield power, provided that you think carefully and plan wisely. And so, for example, the importance of having a strategy, the importance of understanding your society, understanding your opponent, understanding what resources you have available, what resources you can get, how to win over people to your movement. I think these are all basic principles that I think remain as valid today as they did in the years.
Sure. We should actually mention, because Erica Chenoweth wrote a book with Maria Stefan, what was it, 5 years ago or so, which was very influential because they did a historical count. I wish I had the numbers in front of me, maybe you even remember them, but that can you kind of summarize the very punchy conclusion that they reached about the effectiveness of nonviolence compared to violence in historical cases? They assembled a number of cases. Do you remember what the numbers were? I've forgotten the percentages, but it was very impressive. In those days, that first book was very convincing.
I think they were testing some of these theories, and they were looking to get some data that looked at the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance compared to violent campaigns. So they looked at something like, I think, around 350 campaigns, both violent and nonviolent, as well as mixed campaigns. So nonviolent movements that had what they're calling a radical flank, so a violent wing. And they were comparing these movements to see to what extent did various of these movements achieve the objectives for which these struggles were waged. And they found something that, was really quite revolutionary, not necessarily for those of us who kind of understood the stories and understood the whole history of this, understood that it wasn't very well understood, but for I think people who sort of believed in realpolitik and
Erica Chenoweth herself, because she was she went into it not believing what she was going to find, and she was convinced by it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I think that they were
So,
definitely. So I think what their findings show is that campaigns are about half the time they achieve their objectives, whether violent or nonviolent. That many of them fail in general, but that nonviolent resistance campaigns that use nonviolent resistance are twice as likely to achieve their objectives. They also say that even nonviolent campaigns that fail are more likely to result in a democratic society within 5 years.
Yeah,
really
and the other interesting to me was that one of the main reason why nonviolent works so well is that people don't want to get killed. So what determines the success or failure of the movement is how many people show up to be active in it. And because people, do not want to get injured, if they know that it's going to be nonviolent, they're much more likely to show up. And that's what matters. So the number of people that you're able to bring out into your campaign is a very important indicator of whether or not you're likely to succeed. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the problem is that since then, things have changed a little bit. And it looks as if what was working so beautifully in the samples that Maria and Erica collected, historical events, violence isn't that successful nowadays. What did you went to hear Erica talk about this recently? What did she say? Do you recall? We can always check what she did say, but.
Yeah, I think that she was presenting her research and it's as compelling as ever. But I think some new questions, just to kind of move on from Erica's research, but I think that some of the questions many of us in this field have are what is to account for this increase in nonviolent action, but also a decrease, right? A decline in effectiveness, right? This is what we're seeing in the world. You've alluded to it. I think many of us see really large-scale mobilizations, but not anything really substantive in the way of real achievements, right? So here in the US, we saw a midterm election that had the highest voter turnout in perhaps our country's history for a midterm election. We saw the election of so many candidates of color, women, people of different sexual orientations. This is, I think, a testament to get out the vote campaigns. It's a testament to nonviolent action and, really, I think, efforts by so many people in our country. So having said that, right, having said that we've had some important achievements, we're also seeing that the level of mobilizations that we're seeing are not really translating to real concrete successes, at least not in the short term, in the medium term. So I think some people are saying that decline in effectiveness compared to movements of the past, given the numbers, right? The numbers that you alluded to, the fact that we're seeing these massive numbers of people highly dissatisfied, taking action, often for the first time, people who don't identify as activists, but people who are regular citizens who recognize that strong action is needed. They're going out in the streets and they're making that dissatisfaction known. The idea is that, the two kind of reasons that people are pointing to as being a cause of this decreased effectiveness is learning by opponents and people.
The bad guys are learning how to counteract what you're doing.
I think there's more knowledge about nonviolent resistance and how it worked,
Mm-hmm.
How it works, and there's lots and lots of entities that don't want to be caught unaware, like the opponents of the past, who really kind of rested on their laurels. And I think that what you're seeing now is that entities of all kinds are being much more proactive about learning how to undermine these movements. And so they're using a variety of very, very sophisticated techniques to do that, including obviously the technology and the monitoring of what activists and organizers are doing in order to anticipate, actions that might impact them, but also an understanding, for example, that violence on the part of nonviolent protesters is actually counterproductive, that it causes, the violence is therefore very difficult to control, that, if keeping nonviolent discipline is an important part of effectiveness in nonviolent resistance, then obviously instigating violence and even perhaps committing it, like using a genre provocateur, is therefore becomes a very effective way to undermine a movement, right? So there's a variety of ways in which opponents, I think, are kind of preparing for nonviolent resistance movements against them and being very effective in undermining them. And we can talk about that. But I think the second piece is this sort of imitation that we're seeing, this idea that as we have more knowledge and information, that information is sometimes quite superficial, and that there's a kind of narrative that has emerged out of the Arab Spring and recent movements, that just showing dissatisfaction and protest and going in the streets somehow effectively or somehow magically produces particular outcomes. And that, if you look at these large scale mobilizations like Gezi Park, like the World Cup protests, like Occupy Wall Street, an observer would think that you can't have this many people in the streets and not, have some kind of impact. But in fact, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing actually opponents are very well able to withstand these types of mobilizations. And so I think a over-reliance on symbolic means of protest, like going in the streets, like the stuff the media is able to capture, I think has actually been a liability for movements. Without the kind of institution building, without the kind of training and planning and preparation that the movements of the past used to do very well, that took longer, that required a heavy investment, that required a structure for leadership, that required a lot of expertise. That's, we're able to bypass that now. And that's not necessarily good. In fact, it's
a terrible thing. But in fact, I'm intrigued by your statement that in the past, movements used to do that. Mm-hmm. I never made that comparison one way or another. I guess I would have assumed that they didn't, that not many movements had a plan for what they would do once once they won the particular battle, mm-hmm. What the struggle would look like next. I know that there is this, I think Bob Helvig uses the word having a vision of tomorrow, that before you get out there and start your action, you'd better have considered what you're going to do afterwards, and have not only institution building, but some consultations among the people who will be participating in creating a new constitution, a new government, etc. What kind of society is it you're trying to build? And I'm not sure, I don't even want to say this. I'm not sure that Gene Sharp himself paid that much attention to it. I interviewed Peter Ackerman a couple of years ago, and I had to say I went into that interview with some misgivings, because I had just sort of come through a rethinking of whether or not I believe that just getting rid of a dictator was really the name of the game. At that point, I was thinking, no, the Arab Spring has failed because people didn't already think through what they were going to do when Balart turned over the keys to the palace or whatever. Whoever dictator leaves, you've got to know what your game plan is, and you better have everybody all ready to do it. And I was not sufficiently thinking about this post-triumph period. And I remember speaking to Peter Ackerman, who was, of course, very much a follower of Gene Sharp and his thinking. And he basically said, well, yes, people are saying that, but I think once we've got rid of the dictator, we've done our job. Now it's for other people. I'm misquoting him, but that was the tenor of the thing. And I think he was implying that Gene Sharp had the same attitude. I think I even asked Gene once about whether or not you shouldn't have pretty careful plans made before you even start a civil resistance movement about what you want to do afterwards, next. And he basically said, something like, no, that's not my business. I maybe, tell me that I'm wrong. I kind of like to believe I'm wrong, because I really, that's where I get stuck. I really do think at this point that starting a civil resistance movement without having really planned and got some consensus about the game plan afterward is risky and maybe reckless.
So I think that he, from my understanding of Gene's written work and the conversations that I had with him, and you know, the conversations I had with him until, you know, a few months ago or years ago, I think that there were two things. One was that he said that nonviolent resistance, because of how it operated, required institution building. It required an engaged civil society. It required either the strengthening or creation of institutions that played a role in doing the resistance and conducting the struggle, but also in what came after. So that nonviolent resistance was more likely to produce a democratic society because people had become empowered in the course of struggle. So that was one, right? This idea that inherently nonviolent resistance is democratizing, and that it's not just about the ends, but it's about this type of struggle more often allows that. And Gandhi, you know, said this as well, this idea that he said, if you offer independence on a silver platter, I don't want it, because people will remain as weak as they were before in dealing with future crises. And the idea that nonviolent resistance, you know, and the other thing I heard Gene say was that nonviolent resistance is not a panacea to the world's problems. It is a technique of struggle that can be used for particular objectives. It doesn't solve every problem in your society, and that it doesn't produce perfect societies, and that we cannot expect that because no technique of struggle does that. So let's be fair about the criteria with which we use, you know, which we use. So violence, for example, we still say it works, even though violence sometimes, you know, achieves particular objectives, but then goes on to, you know, produce other political problems. So I think nonviolent resistance as well, you know, let's be fair about, first of all, the criteria with which we judge success and failure. But the question of whether a movement should plan for what comes after a success is something he, I think, emphasized very, very strongly in his work. And I think there's lots of evidence to that. He says that the period of time following a successful revolution is, in fact, a period of great uncertainty, and that movements must take great pains to plan for what to do and what to do to prevent a new kind of a new dictator from, you know, what did he say? Kind of exchanging one set of shackles for another. And so he emphasized that, I think, a lot, about the need for planning for what follows. And you know, we ought to pay more attention to it. I mean, you know, his publication, The Anti-Coup. The Anti-Coup is precisely about that, about how to strengthen particular systems of government so that they can prevent, defeat, and potentially deter illegal usurpations of political power. And that can be following a successful revolution. I think it's a very, very clear message in Gene's work, and one that we have not adequately followed. Because I think people are impatient for political change, understandably so. And, you know, they recognize that they'll, you know, kind of present these challenges and then kind of figure it out. But what we're seeing is that nonviolent resistance does produce particular consequences, and that if people are not prepared for them, that we're seeing the kinds of outcomes that we're seeing in different parts of the world. I think it's a complex topic, but that it's, you know, about bringing down a particular kind of system and then that's it. That, I think, is a huge mistake, and one we're seeing the consequences of in our world today.
Well, I'm glad that you're reminding me that he did make that point, because it certainly is a point that has come to bother me a lot. You know, used to go to Russia a lot, and I was trying to promote nonviolence methods and interest in it among the people I knew who were interested in and great believers in democracy. And they didn't have much interest in it. And basically they would say to this day, you know, if we, the people of Russia have not had any history of democracy and don't know how to make it work. There's no culture of decision-making by the population. And if you got rid of Putin by a regime change of some kind, you just get an even worse guy tomorrow. And I didn't like to hear that and didn't listen to it very much. But I kind of began to think, yeah, there's something to that, that some kind of preparation is necessary. I remember having a conversation with Lyudmila Alexeyeva in Moscow. She was one of the great, she's a heroine of mine, well into her 90s now, and was one of the leaders of the human rights movement and so on. And she said, be patient. She was correcting me. You know, you should be more patient with it. It's going to take us time because, you know, when you let somebody out of prison and they don't know how to take care of themselves, they've been in prison all their life. It's a terrible struggle. They don't know what to do. It's no favor to let them out of prison. Mm-hmm. And so you have all these people now responsible for making decisions about their own lives when they've had no experience of doing that. It was always that the government told us, you can have this apartment or you can have a job, and this is what you're supposed to do. And we don't have the experience of knowing how to organize ourselves. So it's going to take, she said, 15 years for us to learn enough so that we could actually have a working democracy. Well, that was something she told me something like 15 years ago. It doesn't look as if it's getting any closer. But I did listen to her about that something not only in preparation in the culture, but in building institutions in advance so that you know what your blueprint at least is before you carry out a resistance movement. It is, to me, a cautionary thing. And it makes me a little bit susceptible to listening to all of these people who say that, you know, who are very critical of the idea of regime change, as if interfering in the governance of another country is a bad thing. And that, of course, that's what Gene Sharp was alleged to be doing, helping other people overthrow their regime. And I was all for having helped a number of countries to overthrow their regime. I don't know. And I don't think we've thought through, at least I haven't thought through, what is a legitimate kind of interference or advice or participation in the political affairs of another country. I'm not so sure. I mean, we're now very critical of Russia for hacking the US election. Well, I certainly am. On the other hand, if the shoe were on the other foot, I would not be as critical, I think. So I don't know. I think we have to figure out what are the legitimate boundaries, or what should be the proper boundaries for people in one country to try to exert influence in the political actions and decisions of another country.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am not a proponent of that type of foreign interference, having come from a country that has had a very high level of it, and that's been very much to our detriment, with all the kind of countries and intelligence agencies and agendas that have been really destroyed Afghanistan. And I think what we do, or what my approach is, and I think Jean shared this, was really the idea that we kind of develop this knowledge and we make it widely available, and we make it available in a very sort of democratic way. And by that, I mean, we're not prohibiting its use from anyone, and we're not advocating its use by anyone either. We're really making it available as widely as possible, as high quality as possible, so that people who need it have access to it. And that includes people that we don't necessarily agree with. And so that's the approach of the Einstein Institution, and that's one that we're definitely going to preserve as the institution moves forward. This idea that if we want less violence in the world and we want more empowered populations to conduct struggle effectively, then we have to, again, make this information available and increase access to it. So I think that's the approach that I think works well in this situation. And Metta, as far as, you know, just one thing, I think we have to remember that democracy itself is also a process. I mean, our democracy here in the United States, we've seen some major backsliding. And the idea is, I think, that these are principles that apply in all of our societies, and they allow us to, or I think they make clear the idea that our democracy is only as good as our capacity to defend it. And our capacity to defend it really depends on understanding what our rights are, understanding how we came to get them, that they weren't handed to us, that people fought for them, and also then, you know, what are our rights, and then how do we defend them? How do we defend them? And so we are that second piece of it, right? The how.
A whole other conversation I wish we could continue for another hour.
Yes.
But we don't. And that is, I would like to talk further about something that continues to bother me now. More and more, I have to say that I think democracy is not working. And maybe it's not just a momentary thing. It may be that, that democratic decision-making does not necessarily give you the best decisions. And that sometimes, I'm not even sure, well, there's a whole book recently I read about it called Realism to Democracy or something like that. Anyway, it gave me a really serious reflection about what to do if you think that fundamentally the citizenry may not be able to come up with the best decisions, optimum decisions. And what else you have left over? You know, what do you have, if you believe in democracy, what do you want to keep and what needs to be fixed, and how are we going to fix it? And what is there a special role for expertise in there that some people know more than others, and maybe, okay, compare what's happening in the US today with China, which is absolutely not a democracy whatsoever. And there's a series of articles right now going on in the New York Times about the fact that we thought that China would stumble and fall and its great transformation, but they're just forging right ahead, and they're developing extremely well when we thought that they would run into great difficulty because of not being democratic. What do you do? This is not a conversation to have with Gene Sharp. I wouldn't have ever broached the subject with Gene Sharp somehow, but I didn't think about it in those days. I'm only thinking about it now and worrying about it now. And I don't even like to acknowledge that I have these concerns about how do we overcome the fact that the general population may make some catastrophically stupid decisions. And it's not because we have a tyrant, it's because democracy doesn't always work very well.
Well, Metta, I'm from Afghanistan, and I'm going to be really careful about the fact that, you know, what I'm seeing in the world today is a failure of democracy. I'm going to be very difficult about characterizing it that way, coming from a country that, you know, in many ways has never experienced it. And I do see some very, very troubling trends. But again, I'm not sure that it's a failure of democracy as a principle, but in fact, maybe a failure of how we understand democracy and the way in which it's actually playing out in our societies. And the idea that for too long, we thought democracy was something that, you know, our so-called founding fathers, you know, established, and then we just get to sit back and relax and reap the benefits of it, when we know that even at that time, it was not a good functioning democracy, and it certainly is not one now. But you know, I think we fight to improve the system, and that what we're seeing in our country with large, you know, at least in the United States, with large, you know, communities that are feeling very disenfranchised, is really to a large degree, you know, the sort of degree of helplessness, and that, you know, again, democracy is not a you know, is not just elections. It's the existence of engaged citizenry. And I think we're seeing, you know, just some very worrying indicators that people are, you know, feeling helpless and putting their trust and faith and futures in the hands of leaders that claim to deliver them, you know, deliver them what they think is going to improve their lives. So I think it is complicated, but this is not really rattling my kind of belief in democracy. It's really an understanding that democracy requires constant engagement, and that we've dropped the ball.
I mean, 45% of the American population supports Trump. The great majority of the Russian population supports Putin. And if you look, you know, around Hungary and Poland and places, even Italy today, they're all showing a desire for policies that are colossally stupid. And a large part of the population wants that. And, you know, I don't know what to do with that. That's fact. It's very troubling to me.
Well,
and it means something's got to be fixed, but I don't have a clue how to fix it or what to do about it. You're right. There are a lot of other institutions besides voting that need, you know, there's the rule of law, there are human rights, all kinds of things that, and especially civil society. I think giving probably the way forward is to do more to empower civil society organizations to have an input into decision making. But I don't know how to do that. I have some ideas, but very sketchy. Here we are. We get to the juicy part and the worst part, the most troubling part, as we get to the end of our conversation. So, how to wind it up on an upbeat note? I don't know. Do you have any upbeat thoughts? Yeah. You can tell me about MIT. You were telling me that you have some support and help from some lab at MIT. Tell me a little bit about that before we sign off. We're overdue, but that's okay.
Sure. I'll just say briefly that I am I'm still working with the board of directors of the Einstein Institution, but I'm currently sort of housed, if you will, at the MIT Media Lab, where I'm looking at how we can sort of strengthen the existing theory and material in by looking at how it can be strengthened by, you know, introduction of different technology and tools that can help, you know, assist and facilitate the collection of this knowledge and also the sharing of it in a secure and timely way to people who need it. So I'm looking on potentially developing a platform that can make available this knowledge, add to it, really look at what people are doing around the world and incorporate that in a kind of timely way, and then share that with the people who need it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's wonderful. I'm glad that you have that kind of resource. I wondered whether or not the Albert Einstein Institution would be able to survive Gene Sharp's passing. It sounds like you're on the way to that.
Yes, well, certainly the need for it continues, and the dedication by our board and people who support this work and is also very strong, and remain, you know, everyone remains as committed as ever. So we're very hopeful and optimistic about the, you know, the continuation of our work, and we're, you know, really again very dedicated to it. It's incredibly important, and unfortunately, the need for it is not declining. You know, we're seeing just a lot of the need for these tools and the availability of this material.
Bless you. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Jamila.
Thank you, Metta. It's been great.
Good wishes by all means, and we will stay in touch.
Very good. Thanks a lot.
And good wishes to the entire institution.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.